Quick show of hands. How many of you know that the state of California doesn't stop at the shoreline, it actually extends 3 nautical miles offshore? Oh, good. All right. Most of you. Okay. Well, I am very well aware of the lateness of the hour right now, and so I am going to move quickly through this presentation. I've been working for BOEM for 6 years now, and BOEM used to be the Minerals Management Service. I worked for Minerals Management Service for 1 week before it became BOEM-RE. This is the 2010, right after the disaster in the Gulf of Mexico. And one of the first projects I worked on was fixing the Submerged Lands Act boundary for California. So that's what I'm going to talk about today, is when I say the word fixing, I'm talking about permanently immobilizing the federal, state, SLA, Submerged Lands Act boundary, why we do it, what are the benefits, the states where we've already done it. I'm going to be talking about states we're currently working with to do this right now. Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Alaska, Cook Inlet planning region in Alaska. So when we're doing this, the Submerged Lands Act boundary is the boundary that divides state and federal waters, and that boundary is ambulatory. It moves when there are changes in the shoreline, either erosion or accretion or avulsion. The Submerged Lands Act boundary allows us to permanently immobilize that boundary. And that's a good thing, but the boundaries must be done through a decree issued by the Supreme Court. And we describe the boundary using a list of coordinates. And when the baseline moves, the shoreline of the United States moves, and we're talking about an immobilized SLA boundary, the ambulations of the shoreline have no effect on a fixed boundary. And I'll also talk about the AG zone boundary, which is another 3 nautical miles offshore, and that also becomes fixed when you fix the SLA boundary. This is a thing to do. This is really good. It's a lot of advantages to doing this. It provides certainty to people that have, companies that have leases in the offshore. If you have a lease in state waters, or you have that's sort of near the boundary, the SLA boundary, or if you have if it's a company that has a lease in federal waters and it's sort of near that boundary, you will never have to worry, if that boundary is fixed, you'll never have to worry about whether someday that lease that's in federal waters will someday be partly in federal waters, or if it's in state waters, it'll become partly in federal waters. I think I said that right. Ensures continuity in contractual relationships, gives greater certainty as I said, to the lessor, and gives certainty to revenue expectations. We've done this 6 times so far: Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Texas, Alaska, the whole north shore of Alaska, and in California. Here's the Gulf of Mexico. Texas and Florida, their boundary, the SLA boundary, extends 9 nautical miles offshore instead of the usual 3, which is the Submerged Lands Act boundary describes. The easiest explanation for why that is Spanish land grants. What it does, actually, what happens when you have that is what you get is a wraparound. So you have the SLA boundary for Louisiana there in the upper right-hand corner, 3 nautical miles from shore, and you have the Texas boundary, which is 9 nautical miles from shore, and the seaward boundary, that's the 8G zone. That's where we share revenues. If there are any leases that fall within that zone, any revenues that are gathered are shared between the federal government and the state. But so that because we have that 6 nautical mile gap, we have actually a wraparound that connects the zones, and so that's what you're seeing there. Same thing happens in where Alabama and Florida come together. There's not any leases in this area, so it's not quite the same situation, but we still get that wraparound is what you see. As I said, the whole north shore of Alaska, that's a long way. It's hundreds of miles from the Canadian border all the way to Icy Cape over there by Point Hope. That was fixed in 2000. So what you're seeing here is the SLA boundary, the red boundary, and it's doing that figure 8 around those islands, those barrier islands. And the green line, that's the 8G zone, extent of the 8G zone. Similar situation for California. We have the SLA boundary, red, 3 nautical miles from shore, and the offshore islands, like the Farallones, So the SLA boundary, 3 nautical miles offshore, the Farallones only have the 8G zone surrounding. And if there's a marine sanctuary, as there is for the Farallones, there'll be no oil or gas drilling in that area. So for Virginia, because of BOEM and their efforts to produce the 5-year plan, there was a plan, part of the plan was to offer oil and gas leasing in the Atlantic. And so my boss's boss was saying, we need, Doug, as much as possible, try to work with the Atlantic states and see if we can fix the SLA boundary for the Atlantic states. So over the last couple of years, I've been working with particularly Virginia and the Carolinas to trying to convince them this is a good thing. We should do this, fix the SLA boundary. And so back in 2009, I started looking, or 2010, I started looking and kind of realizing where we were with things. In 2009, they signed half of the supplemental official block diagrams. I'll show you what those look like in a second. In 2014, I sent a letter. I said, let's get together and talk about this. We met in 2015, and they came back in November of 2015 and said, yes, we want to do this. We have a desire to fix the boundary. However, we want you to reconsider where the closing line is for the Chesapeake Bay. So here is an official protraction diagram. This is the area of northern Virginia. You see just a little slice of Virginia in there, mostly Maryland and Delaware. And so Virginia signed those, the block diagrams. Wherever there is a block, you can see this is like a sea of blocks here. There's a 9 square nautical miles. And so whenever a boundary passes through a block, we will make a supplemental official block diagram, which looks like this. And this is one for the Salisbury official protraction diagram. And you can see that Christine Taylor, who was the acting chief at the time, she signed it, and as well as somebody for the state of Virginia. Here's the Chincoteague OPD, and Virginia signed 2 SOBDs up in there in the northern part of it in 2009. They left a whole bunch of them unsigned in the middle, and there's the mouth of the Chesapeake. Here is the Currituck Sound OPD, the mouth of Chesapeake, the very north. And you're seeing right there in the center the border of Virginia and Maryland. And so they left a bunch of them unsigned, and the very southern ones they also left unsigned. There are reasons for that. I'll talk about that in a few minutes. Here's what they were meant about the mouth of Chesapeake and their issue with where the closing line was. The baseline committee decided that these were the places where the closing line for the Chesapeake Bay should be. Those 2 points, those headlands, that's the very mouth of the Chesapeake Bay. And Virginia said, well, no, we don't agree with that. We think it should be more seaward of where that line is right now. So what you're seeing, that red line is where it actually is. The green line is where Virginia thinks it should be. And you can see that it's, instead of touching Fisherman's Island there on the left, they wanted it to extend it out to Smith Island. And there are reasons why the baseline committee took a close look at that and decided that was not the place where we wanted to move the line. So if you haven't heard about the baseline committee, it's been around for a while. And it's basically a group of people that have offshore, that is agencies and bureaus that have offshore responsibilities. And they have a particular interest in knowing where the shoreline of the United States is. And we do that by looking at nautical charts. And so BOEM, or MMS, has been a member of the baseline committee for a long time. I worked for Fish and Wildlife Service, and I was a baseline committee member back then, and I still am a member now. So in March of 2016, Virginia is very serious about this, and they passed legislation that will allow them to fix their boundary. We provided GIS data to them, and then in June, baseline committee said they see no justification to move the closing line for Chesapeake Bay. And I was a little worried about this, but I asked them about this. So what if the baseline committee says no? Is this a showstopper? Is this kill the deal? And they said, no, probably not. We still want to do this. So we were moving ahead with it. They also brought up to me over the phone, they said, well, what about Assateague Island? Have you looked at that lately? Here are some charts from 2003. You can see the little red dots. Those are the baseline points. That's where the shoreline of Assateague Island was. And 13 years later, it moved. The shoreline has moved further south. And they asked me, they said, so can you guys update that? And I said, well, maybe. We might have some time to do that, but aren't we on the fast track here? And so I don't know if we will get the chance to update this area. This is a dynamic shoreline anyway, so it depends where it is one day, might not be where it is the next day. So BOEM and Virginia will be fixing on supplemental block diagrams dated 2005 and 2009. They didn't sign a total of 88. They signed 14 of them. Oh, I'm sorry, they signed 7, and of the 2009, they did not sign 7 of the 2009. We have developed a draft decree that is the Office of the Attorney General and the Office of DOI Solicitor's Office has developed a draft decree based on the California decree. And just recently, they asked that the lateral boundaries be recognized in the decree, and we revised the SOBDs to show that, and revised a legal description to show that as well. So what I mean by that is there is an agreement between Virginia and North Carolina as to where the boundary of the two states go, where that boundary is, but also in what line of latitude extends offshore. And so we have incorporated that and mapped it into where the intersection point is of that lateral boundary with the Submerged Land Act boundary. And have created a supplemental block diagram showing that's where the intersection point is. And it will also show up on a new OPD as well, where the intersection point is. Here's the one for Virginia and Maryland. So what has to happen next? We need Virginia to sign the 95 SOBDs that they haven't yet signed. And we need to have the draft petition brought before the Department of Justice for their review. Virginia really wants to make this happen, and so I think probably be said before the next outgoing governor, or before they have the next governor, so we have about 1 more year to do this. It is on the fast track. I've been talking to North Carolina about doing this. They have a lot of SOEDs. They haven't signed any of the ones that we gave them in 2005, 7, and 9. We requested a meeting back in 14. I met with them in 15. I asked for a decision. So you guys thinking about doing this? And they got back to me and said, well, the thing that really is holding this thing up is that we have a 1998 opinion from a Deputy Attorney General that says that if we were to do this, it would violate our Constitution. And so what has to happen is that another Attorney General has to write a differing opinion, and maybe we can go forward with this. Same thing with similar things with South Carolina. They have not signed the block diagrams. We requested a meeting. I met with them in Charleston in 2015, and I haven't heard from them. I don't know where they are with this and why, what their reasoning is or why they're dragging their feet. I'm hoping that maybe if we fix Virginia, that they'll be more inclined to move forward with this. So we'll talk about Cook Inlet planning area. I lived in Alaska a long time, and I have friends that still work for Alaskans, so I have been talking to them about this, and I said, well, this would be a good thing. I know the Cook Inlet planning area, you guys have you've been doing oil and gas lease sales there. Maybe we should talk about fixing the SLA boundary. And so we sent a letter to them and said we had identified 16 unsigned SOBDs that they need to look at. They got back to us and said, yes, we want to do this. We want to fix the boundary. And here's all the 16 remaining SOBDs all signed. Then we ran into a problem in that when the Supreme Court fixes a boundary, it's usually in response to an existing U.S. versus Texas, U.S. versus Louisiana, U.S. versus Virginia, or some decision, some court where the Supreme Court set in and had to settle a federal government versus a state government. And unfortunately, there is no Supreme Court case that involves state of Alaska and federal government at Cook Inlet. So we've been talking about this. How are we going to do this? And so we have. We're not sure yet how it's going to work out. In case you don't know, this is where Cook Inlet is, and it's right kind of near Anchorage, at the head of Anchorage at the very head of Cook Inlet. Most of the planning area, half of the planning area is actually Cook Inlet. A lot of it is the Shelikof Strait area that divides Kodiak Island from the mainland. There are a lot of SOBDs in this area, 300 actually, and date range from 1994 to 1996. Alaska didn't sign about the 16 of them. They were all in this one OPD, the Mount Katmai example. This is where they thought the closing line should be in that particular area, and here was the other area. They said, well, we don't want to sign the SOBDs because we don't agree with where you drew your lines. but they have since saw the way we see things, and so they have signed the SOBDs. The next steps will be to reach an agreement on how we're going to fix this boundary, whether it's going to be a decree, or whether it's going to be an agreement between the Secretary of the Interior possibly and the Governor of Alaska. I'm not sure how it's all going to play out. And then, of course, DOJ review. And if you would like to read more about the many years that it took to fix the California SLA boundary, it's on our BOEM website at that URL. Was that fast enough?